Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations, Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'd like to also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. I also want to quickly thank our sponsor, Skyfire Energy, who I'll talk about again a little later on in the show. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live, please feel free to post some questions for our guest. As well, for the folks participating in the Zoomcast, please post your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Should you wish me not to say your name, please type the word anonymous before your question, as this show will be shared to our social networks. Otherwise, we'll assume your consent and the use of your name in the broadcast. Tonight's guest is the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, Eriel Deranger, who's been on the front lines of halting the expansion of Alberta tar sands. For me personally, as a climate activist, who also happens to be a fairly large white male, I have to admit I'm in awe of Eriel's bravery, tenacity, and accomplishments. Eriel Deranger, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to A Climate of Change.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here tonight.
It's wonderful. So one of the questions that I like to ask of all my guests is about teachable moments. So for me, the lockdown happens. All of us realize it's a lot more serious than we thought. All of us change everything about what we do. For me, the big teachable moment that occurred to me is that as a climate action activist, it's going to be tougher for you to tell me that we can't afford things. That, and that if we believe something is a threat, it turns out you can find that money, and you can find that money fairly quickly. So that's my big teachable moment. I have others, but what's the thing that really stuck out to you in that time when it first came down?
I think the initial teachable moment that I really resonated with and felt and saw ripple across particularly Indigenous communities was this moment of realization that there was real value, real tangible value to the Indigenous traditional value systems, our teachings, our languages, and how important our elders were in preserving in this moment that really affected, the elderly were the most at risk, and how many people were just like, our elders still have so much to teach us. And there was this urgency around oh my God, I keep saying I want to go back to the land. I keep saying I want to do these things. And in this moment where there was threats of food crises and being in urban centers that increase your risk, there was this moment of being on the land and being able to provide for yourself off the land is really valuable in this moment. And it was a teachable moment for a lot of our communities to see that this system that we have been told, just get over it, join the rest of us, actually has real tangible value in 2020. And it was such a I saw this awakening happening that was on par with what I don't know more, even with communities returning to the land. That was one big one, but I also share yours. Absolutely. We're not actually beholden to the systems that we thought we were.
Right. I was going to mention later on in the show, but you sort of introduced it anyways. Prior to me doing this series during the coronavirus, I was running a series of public events called the Community Climate Conversations. And what I would mention after the land acknowledgement is just that throughout my life, I have been hearing from Indigenous culture that we ought to be discovering a relationship with the land and with the animals. And even prior to the coronavirus, I was telling rooms full of people that, we should have been not just hearing them, but listening to them, and
Mm-hmm.
starting to look at this. And then the coronavirus hits, and now people realize, like, where the food comes from matters.
Yeah, I think like that's, you know, it's always this like really interesting question when it's asked to like an Indigenous person, like, what are these teachable moments in coronavirus? I mean, there's so many. Well, these systems that we've been told that we should be assimilated into these structures and these systems. These are the systems that are gonna replace these traditional values and traditional ways of knowing and being, and we should just like participate in that, are super fallible. And there was sort of this like this I guess like vindication to a lot of our community members around like, actually, knowing how to set a trap and how to like prepare an animal and how to smoke it and how to like read the land and understanding the relationships we have with the natural world is really critical, not just for this moment, but it's really critical in this shift that we need to have. And like I always refer to myself as a half a generation removed from the land, because as a child, I spent most of my time in the bush with my parents, putting out traps, hunting, fishing, all of the gathering, picking medicines. And the only reason we didn't live there full time is because my parents were forcibly removed from our traditional territory for uranium mining. And that because of northern Saskatchewan. So our family's land straddles northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan. So we got like tar sands in northern Alberta, uranium in Saskatchewan, and in the other side of Treaty 8, we have like Site C Dam, and above us we have like diamond mining. And so we're like, kind of surrounded by these extractive industries that have done the one thing that my parents taught me, like, was the opposite. It's like, I grew up with knowing that the trees, the rivers, the mountains, the sky, the sun, the moon, the air, every blade of grass, every creature was my relative. They were, and then we should respect them as such, and we should regard all life. And even when you take a life for sustenance or food or clothing, there has to be respect and reciprocity. And you can't just take for excess, and you should share whatever you have. And it was such a struggle for me growing up as a teenager and into my young adulthood to realize that wasn't a commonplace value system of our society. And I struggled with where I fit, because like I grew up in an urban center, and then like as a teenager and as a adolescent, and then like shifting into this world where everything was the opposite of what I grew up with those value systems. And that same systems and those structures are what have caused this degradation of the natural environment. Humans in positions into bioregions where we're now seeing like viruses jump genomes because we have destabilized the entire ecosystem because of that severing of that relationship with the natural world.
Yeah, it's I hear people that they want to shake their finger at the Chinese, or they talk about the Wuhan wet markets, and to me, I feel like the system as it stands is a bunch of different wet markets just waiting to happen, from what we're allowing to happen to the oceans, to the climate, to you name it. I mean, forget about where we get our chickens and how we get milk and why we're still drinking milk at all. And so do you feel like, I mean, that it's another sort of teachable moment that status quo capitalism has these problems? Do you think, is that something that maybe people are grasping now? Or?
Oh yeah, I think like that, like your first sort of like, this is my big teachable moment. It's like we're seeing that these systems of predatory capitalism and the status quo of what we've been told, like these are the economics of our province, of our country, of the planet. This is how it works. Free market capitalism. This is the way to go. And because of free market capitalism, we can't do A, B, C, and D. So sorry, survival of the richest really is what it became. Yeah. And what COVID has kind of done is it's kind of like expose those cracks in the foundation of these systems. And these systems of like predatory capitalism are really predicated on the same value systems of colonialism. Like colonialism, which came also with a system of white supremacy, of like some people came here and saw other people and didn't value them as humans, and they thought themselves superior. And then they tried to annihilate an entire race and value systems and replace them with their own, which is 100% a system of white supremacy. And that system came with it a system of capitalism that upheld them in this higher, like, class system that was then imposed on this continent, on Turtle Island, where there was for thousands of years existing systems of commerce and trade, existing systems of agriculture and food systems, and like education. Like we have some of the oldest universities were in the Americas.
Yeah.
We have all of these structures that were essentially erased. And so what COVID has done is it's shown these fractures in this system that for the past 500 years we've been led to believe are the systems. This is it. And if we need to fix climate change, we also have to fix it within this structure, these defined walls. We have to fix every crisis within these defined walls, but these walls are breaking. Those foundations are crumbling before our eyes. The curtain is being pulled back and we're seeing the little tiny man behind the curtain trying to make everything happen in the big machine. And I think that this is like a moment of like, well, we actually need universal healthcare. We need to like get rid of this hyper individualism, and we need to go back to community values, which is what Indigenous peoples practice for thousands of years.
I keep amazing myself whenever I turn on, it's usually Twitter where I get everything from, because I cultivate my own information sources from there. And in the same minute, I saw a post from the National Post, the right-wing conservative National Post, talking about the value of a universal basic income. And then immediately following that in the Globe and Mail, they were talking about a 4-day work week. And I just sort of felt like, wow, like who thought this was coming ever?
I think that there have been many people that have been fighting for this for a really, really long time, and have been trying to say these systems are fallible, they're full of cracks, they actually perpetuate and widen the gaps of marginalization and discrimination. And like I think like for me personally right now, talking about white supremacy, talking about discrimination and hyper individuality, like look at what's happening right now in the United States. Like look at what's happening with these systems of like hyper white supremacy within these, like the structures that we're, again, the American dream, Canada's like the land of freedom, all of these beautiful things. And obviously there are really great things about these countries, about both of our countries, but they're built upon systems of deeply entrenched racism. And our capitalist system is built upon extractivism and destabilizing our ecosystems and our relationships, not just with each other, but with the land and the natural world. And we're seeing the tenets of how it's not just showing up in this, viruses jumping genomes, but how humanity is crumbling. The amount of racism and the rise of the fascist right-wing regimes is wild to watch. But it's a product of that destabilization, these disconnects that have gotten us to this place. And within that sort of ugliness, the positive of COVID is that people are starting to see the world for what it's really become.
Do you know what I was thinking about actually throughout this, I've been trying to wrap my mind around exactly what form of organism a virus is. And I can't even really tell you that I understand whether it's actually an organism or not. But what's amazing to me, and the realization that I think it may be of value to Indigenous folks, is that it's not our civilization that said, whoa, pause, we can't do all this. A virus shut us. A virus pressed the pause button. The world, life pressed the pause button. It wasn't any choice by humans. It was life. It was the world.
Yes, and there have been people asking for that pause for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
there have been people advocating for universal health care, 4-day work weeks, like recognizing the hidden labor of women, exposing the fallacies of capitalism and racism and the disconnection of nature and how that has like precipitated all of these challenges that we're faced with now. And like COVID is the natural world just being like, yeah, enough's enough. Sorry. Like, there's been people trying to like say this to you for a while and you're not listening. And, they still speak to us. And I think like that's the really beautiful thing is we're seeing like a lot of Indigenous folks. There's a lot of like stories of prophecy. There's a lot of stories like deep teachings that people are like leading into in this moment from and again, Indigenous communities, but like people that are connected to the natural world are experiencing this slightly different. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, now we're all in the same boat. That's not actually true either. We're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same shitstorm.
Yeah.
But everyone has a different boat. Some of us have much more luxury. Like, let's compare the celebrities, quarantining in their private yachts and their mansions. Well, some people have like 3 kids in like a 40-foot square room in China. Like we're talking about very different vessels in which we have to navigate the complexities of our society starting to crack, and it can be really, really scary and overwhelming. But I think what's really beautiful also is that COVID has also shown us that when push comes to shove, we can drastically change so much of what we do.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the prime teachable moments too. I guess so. One of the biggest picture questions I think on the whole planet right now, other than when is COVID in our rear view, is this the moment? Is this where we actually shift to the low carbon, climate friendly future that we need? Nobody knows the answer to that, but I'd be interested in hearing what you think.
I think, there's some interesting things happening around that because a lot of people are like, oh, the skies are clear. You can see Mount Everest. You can, see the skyline in Los Angeles. Animals are swimming in the canals in Venice. And there's all these beautiful moments. The air quality is great everywhere because of the reduced, not just like air traffic, but just traffic in general. But at the same time, climatologists have said it's not enough. It's not enough. Like the individual impacts of you and I as individuals and every other human on this planet making the choice to not go on that trip, and like whether it's by car or by plane or by boat, and being forced to not have to take that trip, and like having to like really think about our food and all of these things, it has like shifted stuff, but it's not enough. And what that really begs to sort of propose the question of is like, where are the fundamental shifts that still need to happen in order for us to achieve that low carbon future, that future that we have all been talking about within the climate movement? Like the UNFCCC, the UN Foreign Convention on Climate Change, has been like navigating like, how do we get there? What do we do? How do we create these mechanisms? And the reality is that it's going to take more than just suspending air travel. It's going to take a fundamental shift in our food systems, which we've also seen fall apart. We've also seen food supply chains become completely paralyzed with like the Cargill factories, the meat plants not being able to process, and animals being euthanized because of these systems that don't work, and how we have to restructure the simple things from like where our food comes from. Has deep impacts on the climate. And thinking about how we travel and how the military is one of the biggest emitters of emissions on the planet, and how we can like restructure like even huge office buildings they're huge emitters of carbon and on this planet. And
Mhm.
and now we've realized we don't even need those office buildings because everyone's been able to work from home.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many shifts that I think that we could absolutely shift to. And the biggest one of all has been this huge crash in the price of oil and the
Mhm.
massive shifts where we've seen, not just from an economic standpoint, but how renewable energy is much more stable and reliable in these markets and in these times than the antiquated fossil fuel systems that we've been told we cannot shift from.
Mhm.
We have to shift from them.
You've anticipated my next question perfectly, given your work on the tar sands. In fact, uh, it was shortly after I saw the film that features you. I think it's Elemental. Is that the name of the film? Yeah. Um, if I were really on my game, I'd have that in front of me, so I'm not guessing. But uh, shortly after that, America discovers how to frack, and all of a sudden changes Alberta forever, so that our prime customer becomes a competitor who
Yep.
it'll take whatever it wants from us, but doesn't need as much as will never need as much again. Uh, that happened around 2014, 2015, and then all of these hits kept coming to Alberta's oil and gas only ideology. Um, I feel like, you know, first of all, I just want to get your impression of the pre-COVID, all the things that were hitting our that industry.
Obviously the American context of the opening up of the fracking industry really, really aggressively hit Alberta, and this sort of one-stop shop economy that we've built over the last 55 plus years. But it wasn't just that, because like simultaneously we were seeing a shift internationally
Mm-hmm.
to look at and more to look more aggressively at renewable energy systems. And this was happening. We've seen China take leaps and bounds at pushing forward in solar and wind power. We've seen the countries like developing nations push for those things. And it's also like there's this, like, it's not just like, oh, America just screwed us because they're fracking and now, oh, we're so screwed, we should be angry at the American system. But the world is changing, and the Alberta governments and our economic systems weren't, doing the work to shift and pivot when it was necessary. And now we're in deep trouble. We
Mm-hmm.
have an entire economy that has been pegged against whether or not we can get our oil to market. And that was used to be the problem like 3 years ago. And now the problem isn't whether or not we can get it to market, it's whether or not there's a market to buy this oil.
Right.
And there isn't, because the price has bottomed so much that we would literally have to pay people to take this oil, because it is a heavy crude oil that requires massive amounts of refinement, which we don't have the facilities to do here locally. And it's causing havoc on our natural ecosystems and the lives of those communities that rely on those systems. It is a economic crisis, it is a health crisis, and it's an Indigenous rights crisis that
Mm-hmm.
has all percolated in this moment, where we still have like ministers saying things like, oh, it's the perfect time for us to build the pipeline because there's no protesters. And why don't we just dump $7.5 billion into assuring that the pipeline that is heavily contested in the United States gets
Right.
built? Like,
Yeah.
yet people are getting laid off left and right in the actual province as these companies, fold and pack up and go somewhere else with
Often taking
billions
money with them. Is that,
with
yeah, taking our
with
money.
billions of dollars exploding from their pockets.
Yeah.
They're not just taking the jobs, like, and this is something that I think a lot of Albertans don't understand. It is not just about jobs. The Alberta tar sands industry and the oil and gas industry in this province has literally underwritten our hospitals, our education systems, our sports and recreations, from like boys and girls clubs to, sports and recreation facilities, and First Nations communities. And we have built this dependency on on an economy and on corporations that literally do not have our interests in mind. And we have had governments that have drank the Kool-Aid from these corporations that are now packing up. Like, should we not have learned the lesson from the thousands of abandoned oil wells in the southern part of this province that we are now literally on the hook for cleaning up? And it's just madness to me. And it has been Indigenous frontline leaders that have that connection to the natural world, that still hear, like literally hear our ancestors, hear our relatives talking to us, that still go, oh wow, this is really not good. Like, I grew up with those rivers, I grew up with those birds, I grew up with those trees, and they're the ones that have been advocating to stop this, because not just what it's doing to the land and to our individual persons, but what it's doing to the entire structure and the fallacy that is embedded within those systems. And now COVID, just like that, exposes it all.
Yep, exactly. Well, even like before COVID hit, and then COVID hits, but before COVID hits, a lot of the big money global players were backing away from oil and gas investment, and then tech happened. That must have been an interesting moment. I felt like I couldn't wait to ask what your thoughts were on when that happened. I mean, the letter from the tech CEO is just like, look at it, read it. Here it is, guys. Whatever you want to say is the reason. Here, look at the letter if you want. It's right here, right?
Yeah, I mean, before COVID, it was all falling apart already.
Yeah.
And like, you know, the price of oil was crashing since 2014 continually. We were not seeing the recovery that was promised by both our politicians and the corporations and the, you know, economists saying, oh no, we'll recover from this, it'll be fine. And in fact, actuality, it's gotten worse. And you add that on to the fact that at the international level, there have been these two really interesting tandem issues happening. One, we're seeing more progressive work being done to advocate for climate action at an international level. And within those discussions of climate action, we're seeing Indigenous rights being upheld as critical to meeting those climate ambitions. And then nationally, we have Indigenous communities raising the alarm bells on how these projects are, you know, adding to the abrogation of treaty and Aboriginal rights, the health and safety of our communities. And while we understand we're a part of these global economic systems, we need a just transition. And so now we're in a time in this province where a transition is inevitable. And now it's more around a recovery. What does a recovery from this moment look like? And how do we do it within a framework that upholds tenets of justice, equity, and equality for those that have been marginalized and left out of the conversation, and that were led to believe that we had no choice in the economies that we were participating in? And it's now is this critical moment where if we were doing this within a justice framework, our governments would be tabling conversations with Indigenous communities whose lands we acknowledge all the time, but we don't let them be a part of producing the economic systems and platforms for how we're going to move forward that values, recognizes, acknowledges Indigenous rights and, you know, the colonial settler society. How do we marry systems that don't even speak the same language?
Right. So I hear some of the moves that I see from our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I have reason to be encouraged in the rebuild time, given that, you know, maybe you and I aren't well, certainly we're not happy about the fact that the Canadian government is paying for the oil wells to get cleaned up, but we like that a lot better than oil companies just getting a big sack of money and then the executives making a run for the border. And I sort of, some of what I'm hearing sounds to me like it's possible that climate activists might have a partner in that prime minister's chair towards a low carbon transition. What are your thoughts?
It's challenging. I think like some climate activists, yes, would that might work, but there's really deep long-standing challenges around how we reconcile Indigenous rights issues, and our ability to assert our sovereignty and self-determination in our lands and territories within these structures. And how do we move beyond just like, you know, Indigenous communities giving recommendations and the decisions being had behind closed doors without our people there and involved, in the same way that a lot of climate activists have been like, we need to do these things, and governments are like, okay, I guess now we're going to listen, but it's still being predominantly middle class white folks that are holding those positions of power and influencing those decision making decisions being made at some of the highest levels. And so how do we shift these power dynamics? Like, that's, for me, like, that's this big question. It's like, where is the power? Where is the resiliency actually held in this country that we live in? And it's in our communities. Like, when push comes to shove and we need to show up for each other, we have seen like COVID community responses pop up everywhere in every city. And it's community that's showing up for each other and filling those gaps and those cracks that the government has left wide open. And that's okay. Like, we should show up for each other in community. Like, that's a good thing to do, but that's where power lies. And yet those very people are never considered or never consulted or never included in those decisions on how we're going to rebuild and reframe and re-envision what not only this province looks like, but what this country looks like. And that's where we really have to start to think, how do we shift those things? And so for like Indigenous Climate Action, even before COVID, that's what we worked on. We worked on like, how do we bring our communities as Indigenous peoples to see their culture, their language, their traditions as not just like empowering and feel good and be proud to be Indigenous, but critical and valuable to the discourse on what climate solutions look like. And that means climate solutions aren't just about building a big solar farm. It is about that, but it's not just about that. It's also about like really like reconnecting with the land, reestablishing the value systems and the core foundations of our country that guide what economic systems look like, guide what resources are viable and valuable to our communities, and how we move forward in ensuring that there's a distribution of that wealth and that prosperity that's shared amongst everyone to eliminate those systems of predatory capitalism and hyper individuality.
Yeah, I agree totally. I hear a lot of people starting to talk about using the term just recovery instead of the just transition. And I'm going to be speaking about it later. I do a sort of a personal thoughts thing at the end, like from time to time. And so I'll speak a little bit more on that later on. But what kind of just recovery do you think, what sort of low-hanging fruit do you think for Alberta and Calgary that we could do that creates prosperity, helps us on CO2, probably helps us on our own personal health? Are there some things where you feel like, why on earth don't we just do this?
One, I just feel like I don't know how viable it is, but for me, I'm just like, climate reparations, like these corporations should be paying climate reparations to this province. Like, they have extracted and released and created immense amount of carbon emissions that have made Alberta one of the highest per capita carbon emitters on the planet.
Yeah.
And yet you and me didn't do that. And like almost every Albertan didn't do that. It's the corporations that did. And there needs to be reparations paid for that. Whether or not we'll ever see that, I mean, look at the abandoned oil wells situation, probably not. But the reality is that I think we need to be demanding more. Like, we can't just be bending over to the will of corporations. And like, I really question whether or not, like, how that has come to be the standard norm here. And that in the future, any extractive industries need to have royalties that are on par with what is being extracted from the land. And lastly, there needs to be assurances that we have like direct royalties to communities whose lands these things are being extracted from. And so what do you do to get there? I think that the best thing, the easiest thing for like everyday Albertan is that we need to demand a real transition off of these fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
We know that we can't just shut the tap off of our economy is literally pegged against, but there has to be justice for the workers, absolutely, because this is their lifeline. This is what puts a roof over their head and food on the table. And we have to think about the workers, not the corporations. We have to think about ways in which we can address the immediate concerns around food insecurity, housing security, and just like everyday living. So universal healthcare or universal income, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And ensuring that we are thinking about the safety and security of all people. And then the last piece that needs to be fundamentally addressed is that during the COVID crisis, one of the biggest, like we're seeing it in the Navajo Nation, but in Canada, like as well, is like wash your hands all the time, right? But there are communities that don't have the ability to wash their hands. You know, like Lubicon Cree only got like running water like 6 years ago. And there are other communities that don't have potable running water or safe drinking water. And we have to address the inequities that have existed in this province for decades, if not centuries, if we are going to achieve a just recovery. It cannot just be about replacing this economy with a new economy. It has to be a justice system that addresses those legacies of harm that have been created over the last 150 plus years under the colonial governments of Canada.
Yeah, that's one of those things. It's kind of like when racism openly rears its ugly head in America. It's the same sort of shock when you realize there are communities in Canada that don't have water. Like it's equally shocking to me. All of it is shocking, and all of it indicates that massive change is required.
We need a systems change, and COVID has basically said, sorry, humanity, you need a systems change. And it's doing it in like such a horrific way. You know, it's so challenging. Like I know my own family, my 9-year-old son struggles with anxiety and worry. And there are many people that are living in this paralyzed like time right now where they feel uncertain of how to move forward. And I think that there's a really big responsibility of our governments and of our leaders, and not just colonial leaders, but our leaders, just leaders in general, like whether you're activist or a First Nations leader or colonial government leader, there's a real responsibility for us to try to find and model ways that are going to give that security back to our people, but in a way that allows us to start seeing each other and seeing our relationships to each other, and reestablishing those connections to the natural world, reestablishing like our connections to our food systems. I say to the natural world, and sometimes people don't understand what that means, but it's like knowing where your food comes from, understanding like the trade, if you're getting like an iPhone, like where is it coming from? Where are the metals coming from? Where are the things that we're consuming, and how do we like reimagine like connecting with those trees and our relatives in a real tangible way, but also in like a really big ethereal way.
So my final question before we go to our panelists is what's your advice to folks like me or the Calgary Climate Hub if we're trying to usher in a just rebuild or adjust, etc.?
As much as it feels like the opposite of what you should do, is take your time when you're doing it. There needs to be the reestablishment of relationships that are healthy, particularly with those that have been left out of these conversations for so long. And that's not just Indigenous folks, that's marginalized folks, period, because it's those folks that are struggling to find money to buy groceries, or that are relying on our food bank systems, They're the ones that are going to give us the critical answers to where those cracks are in the foundations. They're the ones that are going to have the creative solutions that are outside of the boxes of those that have held those positions of leadership. So good leaders aren't people that always think they have the answers. Good leaders are people that can listen and be willing to have humility and be humble to know that they don't have all the answers, and that their real leadership comes from the people. And so for people in Calgary, it's like, get to know those people that are struggling, figure out where are those cracks, what are the things that we need to do that are going to address not just the systems change, but the community change that are going to add to those system changes. Because if we continue to move forward with not knowing who our neighbors are and just trying to fix the big thing, we're going to still have all those people falling through the cracks in our communities.
Fair enough. Okay, before we go to our panelists, I just want to mention our sponsor. Skyfire Energy has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, municipalities, and First Nations since 2001. They're employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. Okay, so this is our Q&A session. We're going to borrow a page from Canada's Prime Minister and allow our questioners both a question and follow-up question. We'll also take questions via the Zoom Q&A function and from our Facebook Live feed. So post those up. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And again, sorry, please preface your question with the word anonymous if you don't wish us to mention your name. First up, I believe, is an ally of mine from the climate trenches. His name is Michael Gretton. Michael, you're on A Climate of Change. At least, there we go. Hello, Michael.
Hi there. Steve, good to see you. Eriel, great to see you too. Thank you both so much for what you shared today. I really appreciate it. And, you know, some keywords have really come through for me today, community and recovery and transition, just transition, and involving all of us in this. That being said, you know, reality check that here we are in Alberta, and we have a lot of political polarization here, especially you either love oil and gas or nothing sort of mentality here. And at the same time, we know federally with our Prime Minister and you know, there's also you know, Canada did sign on with the Paris Declaration, and there is a strong commitment to climate change leadership in this country as well. So when we look at, I was just looking at a news article that came out last week from Bloomberg about Houston and how they've really made that transition to renewable energy over the last decade or so, traditionally an oil and gas city. And so that gives me some hope for Alberta. And I was also reading an article today that came from the Edmonton Journal, and it's an opinion piece. I don't know if you've seen it, by Grand Chief Billy Morin, and he's talking about First Nations ready to help to rebuild the economy. And he talks about what you guys mentioned earlier about the federal government chipping in $1.7 billion to clean up the orphan oil wells, which, yes, should have been the responsibility of the oil companies in the first place. We know this. So just one more quick thing is a few years ago, I was at an event at the OC, Red Talks, and Melina had spoken, Melina Massimo had spoken. I hope I got her name right. And she talked about renewable energy. And I remember during that session, the moderator, Nicole Robertson, she talked about changing the narrative. So my question is, how can we effectively change the narrative in this province to reduce the polarity, the political polarity and the community polarity? How can we really bring us all together, whether we're traditionally oil and gas type people or renewable energy people? How can we really influence others in our communities through the media, through social media, to really take that leap of just transition that really is more about what you've said about security and safety and all of us community prosperity.
So I think, first off, Melina Labukan Massimo, but most of it was right. She's a great friend of mine. She also works. She also works with Indigenous Climate Action, and I think, obviously there's a lot of what ICA is trying to change the narrative in our communities to feel empowered to speak up and participate in this discourse and this, raging debate of like how we do a just transition, or in this case, a just recovery. But we have multiple polarizing narratives. It's not just about pro oil and gas or not pro oil and gas. We've sort of degraded the polarizing narratives in this province down to that. But the reality is that Indigenous communities that were once vehemently opposed to the oil and gas industries have been broken down by this forced economy into our communities, where we feel like we have no other choice but to participate. And the reality is that changing the narrative is also about exposing truths. Indigenous peoples didn't even have right to legal counsel until the 60s. We didn't have the right to vote until 1960. Indigenous peoples didn't have the right to even participate in the formations of the Alberta oil sands or any of the oil and gas systems. And we, Chief Boucher, who was the poster child for an Indigenous pro-oil leader for years, in his 20s, was blockading the highways against the oil and gas sector. And changing the narrative is about how we change the narratives as coming together as community, and how we can't just be put against each other. It shouldn't be about communities against communities, about who's pro-oil, who's not pro-oil, but how do we build prosperity and equity, not just equality, but equity for all of us. And that comes from a much more deeper analysis than who's pro and who's not. And this comes from the same tactics and strategies that have worked in communities like Fort McKay and other pro-oil First Nations communities, where it's just wear them down over and over again by dominating the major narratives in the public. Is that oil does this, oil does that, oil is everything for us, that we all start to believe it. We all start to drink the Kool-Aid. And how do we disrupt that? Is by imagine if we relied on each other. Imagine if we relied on our neighbors. Imagine if we saw our communities and we weren't just about making the most money, buying the biggest house, having the most ATVs and toys to play with, but we started looking at our prosperity as a community effort. And I really feel like shifting the narrative is more about that. And if we start functioning as communities and relying less on these systems of predatory capitalism and extractivism that have caused so much harm, and a legacy of harm in multiple different facets, from environmental, human health, and Indigenous rights, we can start to see that, there's people even in the oil and gas sector that are just like, you know what, this is pretty messed up. Because these corporations are literally, you're going, oh, super sorry, we're going to leave now, with their pockets bulging with money. And I think that we're starting to see these cracks, and we're starting to have to rely on each other more. And I really hope that we can continue to disrupt this narrative and not allow those powers that be to continue to control that narrative, that we continue to push back in this moment, and that we continue to see and value those that are bringing a contrary discourse to the table, and not just being dismissive. Because with Canada signing on to the Paris Agreement, with these climate commitments, we need to be doing better, not just here in the province, but internationally. And it isn't, again, just about shifting our economies. It's about shifting every single fundamental system. And that comes from the community buy-in, from the everyday person here believing that they have a place in this society, that they're valuable, and that we can be a part of building and reframing what that future can look like.
Thanks for your question, Michael.
Thank you so much. So just a quick follow-up, if you don't mind.
Yep, go ahead.
I guess it's more of a challenge than a question. But thank you so much. I guess my challenge would be, when we looked at the provincial election last year, Kenny ran on pipelines, job, economy. He really sort of brought it down to 3 words, and I'm thinking about the renewable energy movement, and I think if we could really focus on 3 keywords, 3 or 4 keywords that really resonate with safety, security, clean environment, equity. I think if we could really sort of crystallize some of these keywords, and my challenge would be, Eriel, to you and perhaps to Melina as well, and others in the Indigenous community, to jump into the fray with the and write an op-ed that would go into the Calgary Herald and the Edmonton Journal and other dailies, just really sharing what you've shared with us this evening, and giving us some hope about a just transition and a recovery for all of us, that really brings in this transition with renewable energy, and at the same time talking about equity for Indigenous peoples, and greater community collaboration and respect and understanding and working together. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great challenge. I think it's a great challenge, and I will do my best to try to take it on.
Thanks, Michael. We'll see you in the trenches.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Eriel.
Thank you.
Okay, and our next and final panelist is, his name is Chase Cardinal, and he's one of the youths from the Fridays for Future movement from here in Calgary. The story I like to tell, and I'd like all within range of my voice to support these kids, is, they were out when it was minus 27 and minus 30, fighting for climate action when the rest of us were just buckling down and staying out of the cold. I have enormous respect for this group, and so any way that you can support them, I urge you to do so. Chase, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, Eriel. It's been really nice listening to the conversation for the last little bit here. Question for you. Well, I guess for a bit of background, I've been with Fridays for Future for about a year now at varying levels of capacity. And throughout that year, I've also done quite a bit of work with some other both environmental and First Nations groups within Calgary. And something that I've noticed through my time and through my collaboration with some of those groups is that there is a decent amount of overlap. Lots of the coordinators somewhat work together, but something I've noticed is that a lot of supporters sometimes don't necessarily support one or the other groups in the same way that they do with their main group. And sometimes I've noticed, whether or not it's a First Nations rally or if it's a climate rally, sometimes you lose some of those supporters that you have at one or the other. The question would be, how do you better, or what ideas do you have for building better solidarity between those First Nations and environmental groups? Because I know most of us understand just how essential that is in achieving proper climate justice and a just transition away from fossil fuels. And it's something that personally I'm really interested in learning more about, and also just hoping to put that question out there for other people that might be thinking the same thing.
That's a very big question. I will try my best to answer it. I think it's a really not talked about a lot in Canada. I mean, in some sectors it is, but what you're essentially talking about is how do we achieve intersectionality? Because there is silos of movements in Canada. It's women's rights, you got Indigenous rights, you've got the climate movement, you've got like, immigrant rights, and we've got all, we've got like, every single group has its thing, and they should all be fighting for these things. Absolutely. I'm not saying we should be in competition, but how do we start to build those alliances? Where do we see those overlaps that you talked about? And that's a really, really hard thing because Canada was really good at one thing: divide and conquer. We see the reserve systems in this country, like where communities were literally spread like hundreds of kilometers apart from each other when they used to like summer in the same fishing grounds and so on and so forth. And, some communities even pushed way into the far rural northern communities where they never had any aspects and abilities to live. And even with the colonization of folks that were of lesser value, they got placed also far away. And so Canada has created this really like long history of divide and conquer. And so we don't have those conversations. And it's actually the responsibility of us in movements to start to build those intersections in our movements. We need to make the time to not just get so focused on our issues and start to build those relationships. We talk all the time about, oh, relationships are so important, but we talk about like we just make it that those relationships in the group that we're in, but relationships are necessary across boundaries. And I'm gonna like tell this like little story. I always tell this story, I feel like all the time now, but I think it's really important, is that there's a prophecy that I heard from an Alaskan Inuit elder, and the prophecy is that during the last ice age, Indigenous peoples they saw the changes on the land, they knew a great change was coming and it was going to be really difficult for our people to survive. And they called for a great council of all the different nations across Turtle Island to come together. And in order to do that, they had to abandon and let go of their disputes and their wars and all the different sort of things that were going on, to come together to share their knowledge. And they had to share their knowledge and their strategies and their techniques and secrets and medicines and seeds and everything, so that they would be able to survive this great change of the land. But it was also prophesied at that time that there would be another time in which we would see the land change very drastically once again, except it would be much worse than this ice age that they were about to enter into. And once again, all the people of the land would have to come together and abandon their wars and their disputes and share their knowledge in order to overcome this great change in the land. And I really believe that we're there. And it's not just about sharing our seeds knowledge, but it's about sharing our knowledge, sharing our stories, having those overlaps, building intersectional movements with our brothers and sisters in Black Lives Matters, with the refugee movements, with the immigrant and migrant rights movements, with the women's movements, all of these different spaces. We need to start seeing each other and seeing how our collective struggle for liberation from these oppressive systems is all bound together. And there are tremendous lessons to be learned from our brothers and sisters south of the medicine line or the colonial border in the United States, where they have done tremendous work. I'm going to give a shout out to this organization. They're called Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And they have also created this new alliance called the It Takes Roots Alliance. And they're really trying to build these strong intersectional movements in the US with Indigenous groups, like Latina groups or Latinx groups, climate activists, housing rights activists, and the whole gamut. And I really, truly believe that we need to start building those relationships. And it can be as simple as planning, not a meeting for strategy, but planning a meeting to eat together, to sit together once COVID is past and we're allowed to do that stuff, or getting on together on Zoom, not to have a strategy, not to do anything, but to build relationships, because relationships and trust are the foundations of how we can move together in movement.
Right, that was a wonderful answer and a really great story. Honestly, I haven't heard that before, and it's really, I think, quite relevant to what's going on right now. I guess my last little follow-up question would be, do you have any ideas? I mean, obviously you suggested a few at the end there, but is there anything that individually or just as community that people can do if they are inspired, to reach out and to build that community with other movements and groups? Is there anything that, little things that people can do as a first step into going down that path?
I think finding out who's doing what and what speaks to you, because don't try to force yourself into to participate in something that doesn't speak to you. Like, be genuine, show up with your full self, but also be willing to listen. And don't come in thinking you have answers on how you're going to make that relationship work, because chances are, if you do that, you're going to get really disappointed, because every group has their own different strategies, value systems, even their mission and vision might be completely different, but there are always places of overlap. And that's where we have to listen really carefully to each other and see each other. And I really think it's just figuring out what are the different things that are happening in your community that you might have blind spots to, and really trying to explore where are other people experiencing systems of oppression that we might be able to share and share our resources, whether they're human resources, financial resources, food resources, any of those resources, because we all, again, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And some boats might be bigger and might be able to help share that load and capacity. And I think we're at a really, really critical time where we need to be thinking about how we can work together across the boundaries. And I'm really seeing this right now, with George Floyd in the United States and the movement down there. We're seeing that Indigenous folks, people of color, white folks, all across the board are standing up to support the continued rise of the right and fascism in the United States. And we can take real lessons from that. And I hope it doesn't have to get to a point where we see this type of violence in our communities here for us to build those relationships.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for answering a few of my questions there, and it's been a real pleasure listening and talking to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the work that you do, Chase. I have enormous respect for you.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks for staying in the cold, because I wasn't going to do it.
Yeah, they're incredible. Whenever I can, I think about what it's like to be kids. For me, being a Calgarian in oil and gas capital of Canada, it's one thing for me to have to fight that fight. It's another thing to be youths right in front of City Hall, where anybody can walk up and say whatever. I guarantee you, Chase has heard some, as have you, I'm sure, many times. He's heard some some ugly things from our fellow Albertans. But and again, enormous respect for those guys. I think that's almost it for this week's A Climate of Change. I want to thank you so much, Eriel. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, you may.
I just want to say, I actually really love talking to people that challenge me. I have had some of the most incredible conversations with pro-oil people that have come out to protests that I've been at. And They come thinking I want to fight with them. But the reality is when it comes down to it, we're all fighting for the same thing. We all want security. We all want prosperity. We all want what's best for our families. And that's where we have this overlap. And I just want to say, if you're pro-oil and you work in the oil sands, you're not my enemy. We're all in this together, and we all have to find a way out that's going to support all of us equally.
Exactly. I try to make the same case whenever I can. Thanks again so much, Eriel. I wish you luck with all your future endeavors, and of course, feel free to reach out to me and the Calgary Climate Hub if there's things you'd like us to broadcast to our networks. So yeah, thank you very much. Next week's guest is one of Western Canada's prime energy journalists, Markham Hislop. If you want to participate in the Zoom broadcast, be sure to sign up for a Hub membership between now and then. If you liked this A Climate of Change Thursday night broadcast, we want you to know it wouldn't be possible without our excellent sponsor, Skyfire Energy. They paved the way for solar in Western Canada. Will certainly be a big part of our future. I should also mention the Calgary Climate Hub, the organization that I give my time to. If climate is something that creates anxiety in your life and you need to do something, I urge you to join a climate organization or Indigenous Climate Action or an organization that's doing something and can help you move the ball, because I can tell you that's what gets me through the smoky summers, is being able to sit around a table with smart people looking to move the ball, and Calgary Climate Hub moves that ball. I want to thank our volunteers, Shay, Joan, and Paul. And tonight, I'm going to finish with a closing thought. American President Lyndon Baines Johnson got the news on climate change in 1965. That's before humans landed on the moon. My whole life, they've known. Perhaps the best that can be said in defense of we humans doing so very little to prevent this very preventable and predictable global catastrophe is to say, well, it's never really been a good time to do it. Enter the corona moment, another entirely predictable and preventable global catastrophe. Brings civilization as we know it to a shuddering halt. Every nation, every economy, every industry, and every human has nothing but question marks about what comes next, though things like bailouts, rebuilds, stimulus, and jobs programs feel like an inevitable response for most of us. The thing is, if for more than a century there's never been a good time to pause this civilization of ours and deal with the underlying causes of the existential threat of the climate crisis, I can assure you there will never be a better time than now to do exactly that. It only gets increasingly worse from here. That's why this moment is the most critical moment in the entire history of climate advocacy and action, and we need to recognize it as such. Every climate activist, organization, and well-meaning human, for the first time ever, has exactly the same task. Influence your fellow citizens and political leaders so that each bailout, rebuild, stimulus, and jobs program has at its heart the transition, finally, to a climate-safe future. We all need to get on the same page, and that page is still being written. Just now, there are organizations turning the phrase just transition to a just rebuild and a just recovery for all. The Calgary Climate Hub is working on a green stimulus. I speak with folks about an Alberta New Deal. Whatever we decide to call it, the prime mission for all, or for one and all, is finally the same. And it's no overstatement to say that the entire safety and security of humankind's future, that of our children, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, hangs in the balance. Friends, let's get to work. Thank you and good night.